Today is Monday, February 3rd, 2025, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And in this talk, I would like to read and reflect on Aesop's fable of the sensible ass. Aesop's fable of the sensible ass. Let's begin by reading the fable together and then making sure we have all of the details of the fable clear in mind, and then we'll talk about the moral lesson that we can draw from this fable. Again, this is Aesop's fable of the sensible ass. An old fellow in time of war was allowing his ass to feed in a green meadow when he was alarmed by a sudden advance of the enemy. He tried every means in his power to urge the ass to flee, but in vain. "The enemy are upon us," said he. "And what will the enemy do?" asked the ass. "Will they put 2 pairs of panniers on my back instead of 1? "No," answered the man, "there's no fear of that." "Why then," replied the ass, "I'll not stir 1 inch. I am born to be a slave, and my greatest enemy is the one who gives me most to carry." This is the fable of the sensible ass. So having read the fable, let's consider the details that are included here. We have 2 characters in this story. We could say 3 characters. We have an old man, and when we're told he's an old man, we need to make sure we keep that in mind. He's an old man. We have an ass. The title refers to him as the sensible ass, but in the fable, there's no name for him that says that he's sensible. We simply have an old man and an ass, and we're told that they're living in a time of war. So the young men are away at war. This old man is left behind at home, and he is allowing his ass to feed in the green meadow. All of a sudden, this old man realizes that the enemy is approaching. In other words, the men have failed, and the enemy is advancing towards where these people are living. And so he goes to the field and he calls out to his ass or donkey to run away. The enemy is approaching. And we can imagine this animal, who's not wrapped up in the affairs of men, looking around and wondering who exactly this enemy might be and what the consequences would be of being overrun by the enemy. And thinking about the consequences, the ass asks the old man, "What's there to be afraid of? I mean, I'm a donkey. Why would I run away from the enemy? After all, he's your enemy. He's not my enemy. What would the enemy have to do with a donkey?" And so the donkey continues and asks, what exactly would he do? Would he cause me to wear 2 of these packs on my back? You make me carry around this load, and a pannier is like a basket. Imagine 2 baskets hanging over the back of a donkey, each basket hanging at each side of the donkey. It's called a pannier. He asks, would this enemy, if they were to come and take control of me, would they double my load? Would they make me wear 2 sets of panniers? Which is ridiculous. And the old man says, oh, no. They wouldn't make you carry more weight. That's not why you should flee. And so the man expects that the donkey would have the same fears, same concerns that he himself had. And the donkey made it clear that he has no such concerns. He says, look, you might wish to run for your life because you have this hope of enjoying your freedom. When you need something carried, you just throw it on my back. You, being free to live in such a way, value that freedom and see the enemy as a threat because he threatens to take away that freedom, possibly to turn you into a servant. But as for me, I have no prospect of freedom. He says, I was born to be a slave. I was born to be a slave. And so the question is whether I'm going to be a slave to you or whether I'm going to be a slave to someone else. And if I have to choose one or the other, my choice is the one who will ask me to carry less. And so seeing that, as you say, the enemy will not double my load, the worst I'll have to face is to carry the same load, maybe even to carry a lighter load, and therefore I'm not going to stir 1 inch. I've got nothing to lose. In fact, I may prefer to see what life is like in the service of someone else. And so the ass waits, and that's all that Aesop tells us. So we see the reasoning of this ass, and that's why he's called the sensible ass. And we can use the title to help us to see. Sometimes younger students struggle to discern the message, but we can see by the title that the ass is presented to us as being sensible, as making good sense in his reasoning. And so we can see the moral lesson of the fable is to think carefully about the outcomes of different situations and avoid being moved by irrational fears. Avoid being moved by irrational fears, groundless fears. We can see this old man yelling for the donkey to flee was trying to frighten him by telling him that the enemy is advancing. And the donkey, if the donkey would have been irrational or insensible, the donkey might have just got stirred up by the man's emotion and started running without thinking. But we see the donkey doesn't act, but thinks. He doesn't act in response to the emotional appeal of the other man, but he questions what exactly is going on. He thinks about what the possible outcomes might be, realizes that this man's fears have nothing to do with him, and ignores the man's call to flee. And Aesop tells us that this is a sensible ass. So we can see very simply, the simple moral lesson of this fable is to think before we act. Not to simply act like those around us or to allow the emotions or concerns of others to directly affect us, but to keep ourselves calm and detached, and to think before we make any decisions. And we see how the ass actually thinks through the situation. Now, having thought of the moral lesson of the fable, and it's important to make sure we understand the details of the fable, that we read it carefully and keep all the details in mind. And then it's important that we draw a moral lesson from the fable that's general, but is based on the details of the story. It shouldn't be too general. It shouldn't be so general that it doesn't make sense of all of the details, or that it contradicts any of the details. It should be general, though, in that it applies to many different situations, and most importantly may apply to situations we find ourselves in. And so it's good for us to also reflect on how this fable and its moral lesson may apply to our lives. How may this fable apply to our lives? And I'd like to reflect on a religious application of this fable that came to me as I was reading through it. When we think about the Christian message, Christ comes to us and calls us and tells us to follow him. He tells us to follow him, and it's interesting because he says to us to take his yoke upon us. He speaks to us as if we're donkeys, or if we're oxen, animals that will work for him. He says, take my yoke upon you. In other words, become my animal. My yoke is easy, he says. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. My burden is light. In other words, Jesus says to us, come and serve me, because I am a gentle master. I'm a gentle master. I'll treat you gently. I'll have you work lightly. Come and follow me. And what's strange as we think of that message that Jesus taught in the gospel, we often hear people warning us about the dangers of following Jesus. We warn that becoming a Christian, or living like a Christian, following Jesus, serving Jesus, will bring all kinds of trouble and difficulty into our lives. We may even think of other things Jesus says that seem a bit strange. For example, he says, whoever will come after me must take up his cross and follow me. He warns us that we will have to suffer for him. And that seems a little scary to think about. We don't eagerly desire to suffer. But at the same time, even though he tells us that we may suffer for him, we may have to suffer for him, he still tells us his yoke is easy and his burden is light. He tells us that he is a gentle master. So even though there may be trouble, it would seem from Jesus' message that there's much more trouble to be had if we don't follow him. And if we think about the ass's message in the fable, he said, since I am born to be a slave, I will choose to follow the one who requires me to carry less. Since I am born to be a slave, I will serve the master who will require me to carry less. That's the definition for me of a good master, and there's no option for freedom because I am born to be a slave. And so if we think about the message that Jesus presents us with, he doesn't tell us that we're not slaves. He tells us that we are slaves, and he tells us to choose a master. And he tells us that he is the gentler master. He is the gentler master. And so we might ask, well, who is the harsher or stricter master? Who is the more evil master? And we might say the devil. The devil is a much nastier master. You might say, well, but the devil offers us all kinds of pleasures and fun. He doesn't ask us to go to church. He doesn't ask us to do all this study and schoolwork. The devil would have us to eat candy and play games and act silly. It seems like the devil would be a much easier master than Jesus. And when we say that, when we think about that, we don't think about the end. What would serving the devil bring us in the end? Usually we know from experience that after we get done eating the candy and acting silly and playing games and ignoring our work, we often suffer for it. We suffer for it, we feel guilty, we often struggle, we may be poor, we may be sick, we may be in pain. And so the things that the devil says he'll offer us, they usually come with painful and unhappy consequences. And in the end we think, oh, I wish I would have chosen to follow Jesus, because now I see that the devil is a deceiver. He puts these things in front of us, tells us that he's going to offer us all these nice things, and then in the end he leaves us to suffer for them. Whereas Jesus would never do that. Jesus tells us up front that we may need to suffer, but that he will always be with us. And in the end, he will bring us into perfect and everlasting happiness. That's what makes him the gentler master. And so we can see that the devil could be considered an evil master. We may consider other people to be our masters. You may think of people who you try to make happy, people who you try to be friends with, people you try to please, and it just never seems like you can ever do enough to make them like you. Or they may like you one day and the next day they act like you've never done anything good for them. They may say, yeah, you might have done that, but what have you done for me lately? And many times there are people who we do lots of good things for, and they treat us as if we've never done anything. And we say, man, what a mean master. I would serve you, do all of these good things for you, and you would turn around and treat me like I've never done anything. And there are many people who are like that. So we could say that other people could be these nasty masters, but there's another enemy too, another bad master. It's ourselves. We're often very mean to ourselves. We often choose to do things that cause us all kinds of pain and difficulty. Think about it, how many times a person chooses to eat some junk food, thinking about it, how it's going to taste good, thinking about his tongue, and he doesn't think about what effect it's going to have on his stomach or on his body. It'll be on his tongue just for a few seconds, and then it will be in his stomach for hours. And he may have a terrible sick stomach as a consequence for just a few seconds of pleasure on his tongue. And we make many decisions like that. We choose to do things that bring us great sorrow, great pain, great suffering. And so we ourselves can be bad masters. And Jesus tells us that he is a good master. He's the gentle master. And even though there may be times where we need to choose to do difficult things for him, he may ask us to do difficult things, he assures us that we'll always be happy in the end. And he even promises us eternal life. So I think that we can think of ourselves as the ass in this fable, choosing between two different masters. And how shall we choose? The answer is we should choose the one whose burden will be lighter, and that would be Jesus. So that's one possible application. When we're tempted to be frustrated in the Christian life, when we're tempted to run away from the Christian life, we need to be like the sensible ass and think carefully about what our life would be like if we did have to serve a different master. What would our life be like? And whether it might be worse than the other situation. Because many times people think of fleeing from Christianity without thinking that what they're fleeing to will be much worse. And so I think that could be a good application of this fable to our life as Christians. Now, I always explain that when we read these fables, we can often draw many different moral lessons from them. And when we think of different moral lessons, we can also think of different applications. So if you're studying in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and you're enrolled in the Aesop's Fables course and you're asked to share your thoughts about the moral lesson and an application to your life, you don't have to share what I've discussed here. You may see something else in the fable. Sometimes students come up with moral lessons that are even better than the ones I think of, and they can come up with interesting applications. So don't necessarily take mine as the right answer, but read the fable, think about it, think about what moral lesson you can draw from the fable and what interesting application you can come up with for your own life. I hope that's a helpful reading and reflection on Aesop's fable of the sensible ass. God bless.